Islam Makhachev just did what almost nobody thought was possible against a 6'4" opponent with a 5-inch reach advantage. He didn't just win, he controlled nearly every single minute of a 5-round title fight, extending his winning streak to 17 straight and breaking the UFC record he'd previously shared with Anderson Silva. The scorecards read 49-46, 49-46, and 48-47, a clear, comprehensive unanimous decision victory over Ian Machado Garry at Xfinity Mobile Arena in Philadelphia. But the story of how he actually did it is far more interesting than the scorecards alone can tell you. Round 1 set the tone for almost everything that followed. Both men opened cautiously, pawing with jabs, testing range rather than committing to anything meaningful. Makhachev let a few leg kicks go early, probing for openings before he ever attempted to close distance. Then came the first real statement of the fight. Makhachev shot for a takedown using a single-leg attempt, and despite Garry's genuine size advantage, he got him down. Garry tried to scramble free immediately, showing exactly the kind of athletic escape ability that had made analysts believe he had a real chance in this fight. But Makhachev sucked his legs back in and re-established control before Garry could fully break away. From there, round 1 became a defensive clinic from Garry, even if it wasn't a winning one. He worked his way back to standing, eating a knee in the process, then found himself against the cage with Makhachev draped on his back. Garry tried to stand fully upright, but Makhachev maintained the clinch the entire time, smothering him against the fence. Garry worked to break Makhachev's grip, landing elbows to his forearms and wrists, a specific defensive technique that would become a recurring feature throughout the entire fight. But the round ended with Makhachev still holding that clinch, still in control, having dictated almost the entire 5 minutes despite Garry's persistent efforts to escape. Round 2 continued that exact pattern, but with a new wrinkle that showed exactly how Garry planned to survive this fight. Garry landed the first real strike of the round, an inside low kick, before Makhachev attempted his first head kick of the fight, missing before immediately transitioning into another takedown attempt. This time, Garry's takedown defense looked genuinely sharp. He fell forward into a half sprawl, briefly stopping Makhachev's momentum before eventually getting worked to the mat anyway, though only for a moment. Garry scrambled back to his feet, with Makhachev still dragging on him from behind, and the two ended up back at the cage with Garry on his knees. It's worth pausing here to appreciate exactly what Garry was up against technically in these clinch exchanges. Makhachev's takedown entries have been refined over more than a decade of elite competition, built specifically to neutralize taller, longer opponents by attacking hip positioning rather than simply overpowering size differences head-on. Garry's height, the very trait many analysts believed would create problems for Makhachev, actually seemed to work against him once these clinch battles began, giving Makhachev more leverage points to attack rather than fewer. That's a detail worth remembering heading into any future breakdown of taller opponents facing Makhachev's specific style of wrestling. What happened next became the defining image of Garry's entire defensive strategy for the fight. Makhachev started landing knees to Garry's legs while maintaining top position. Garry did his best to fire back with punches, even while Makhachev remained behind him, small shots without much power behind them, but activity nonetheless. He eventually stood fully upright, still absorbing knees to his legs throughout, in what commentators watching live described as pure defense, remarkably similar to how Garry had survived against Shavkat Rakhmonov in the one loss on his record. Garry continued trying to elbow Makhachev's forearms to break the grip, the same technique from round 1, but Makhachev simply couldn't be shaken loose. He didn't manage much actual offense from that position either, aside from a handful of short shots to close out the round, but positioning and control alone were enough to bank another round on the scorecards. Round 3 is where the fight actually started to shift, at least temporarily, and it produced one of the most genuinely competitive stretches of the entire night. Garry reintegrated his oblique kick, the same weapon that had done real damage to Rakhmonov's knee in their fight, following it with a jab. Then came a moment that had the crowd buzzing. Makhachev attempted a sudden single leg, pushing Garry to the cage and actually securing the takedown, but Garry countered immediately and took back control himself. That reversal represented one of the only moments in the entire fight where Garry managed to flip the script on Makhachev's own offense, rather than simply surviving it. The exchanges continued from there, with real back-and-forth energy. Makhachev ran into a stiff jab from Garry while swinging and missing on his own punches, a rare moment of him looking slightly out of sync. He shot in on another single-leg attempt and got stuffed completely. Garry got underneath Makhachev's grip and landed some punches of his own before giving up his back near the cage, wall walking quickly as Makhachev tried to drag him back down. Garry defended a body lock in the corner, punched at Makhachev's leg and body, while nearly accepting an impending takedown attempt, which Makhachev did briefly land before the two returned to a more neutral position. Makhachev tried to kick out Garry's leg at one point, but the defense held solid. Punches started landing tighter and cleaner for Garry as the round progressed. Makhachev did manage one more brief takedown late in the round, though Garry landed belly down with a whizzer and immediately popped back up, more of a repositioning than any real advantage gained. By most accounts watching live, this was genuinely one of the more interesting competitive rounds of the fight, with Garry arguably landing more significant visible offense than in either of the first two rounds. Round 4 brought the fight's physical toll into full view. Garry continued dirty boxing along the cage with short shots whenever the position allowed, working the only real offense available to him from Makhachev's constant pressure. But Makhachev answered by scoring his third takedown of the round alone, an indication of just how relentless his pace had become as the fight wore into its championship rounds. Garry, true to form throughout the entire fight, popped back up almost immediately every time, described by observers as bouncing up like toast from a toaster, a testament to either his conditioning, his defensive instincts, or both. Garry crawled toward the fence again with Makhachev draped across his back, attempting to break the grip, while Makhachev drilled him with knees to the legs and body throughout. At one point, Garry managed to half-turn and land a genuinely clean body shot, only to get taken right back down to the canvas immediately afterward. The pattern repeated, dirty boxing along the cage, Makhachev scoring another takedown, Garry popping back up again as the round wound down. By the end of round 4, Makhachev's face showed visible signs of damage from Garry's short, persistent shots along the fence. Real evidence that Garry's activity, even from bad positions, had actually landed and left a mark. But the control, the takedowns, and the overall round-winning output clearly belonged to Makhachev, who by that point had built what looked like a commanding lead heading into the 5th and final round. Round 5 played out as something of a formality, given how thoroughly Makhachev had controlled the previous 4 frames, though Garry continued fighting with the same relentless defensive effort and occasional offensive flashes that had defined his entire night. Makhachev, working with what was almost certainly a 3 or 4 round lead already banked, continued applying the same pressure, takedown, and control formula that had carried him through the rest of the fight, unwilling to ease off even with the outcome looking increasingly secure. Garry kept looking for the one meaningful exchange that could change the complexion of the fight, but the deficit built across the first 4 rounds proved too significant to overcome in a single final frame. When the scorecards were read, the result reflected exactly what had played out inside the cage. 2 judges scored it 49-46, essentially awarding Makhachev every round, but crediting Garry with a strong enough round 3 to avoid a complete shutout. The 3rd judge scored it 48-47, suggesting a considerably closer read of the action, likely giving Garry credit for both his round 3 surge and his consistent volume of short shots and elbows throughout the fight, even against a backdrop of near-constant clinch and cage control from the champion. What made this performance particularly significant wasn't just the win itself, but everything it validated about the questions surrounding this fight heading in. Garry's size and reach, the 5-inch and roughly 5-inch advantages he carried into the octagon, were supposed to be the great equalizers, the tools that would finally give an opponent the range and leverage needed to keep Makhachev at bay for a full 25 minutes. Instead, Makhachev's entries proved just as effective against a significantly taller opponent as they had against every other fighter across his 16-fight, now 17-fight winning streak. The single-leg takedowns, the relentless pressure into the cage, the suffocating clinch work, none of it required adjustment against Garry's frame. If anything, Garry's own account afterward likely echoed what Diego Lima and others in his camp had predicted, that surviving Makhachev's specific brand of control for extended stretches was exponentially harder in practice than it looked on paper. Garry, for his part, showed exactly the kind of defensive resilience that had defined his one previous loss to Rachmanov, refusing to simply fold under sustained pressure and finding ways to create small openings even from consistently disadvantageous positions. His ability to repeatedly stand back up after takedowns, to land elbows and short shots that visibly marked Makhachev's face by the fight's later rounds, and to actually win at least one round clearly enough to show up on a judge's card, all speak to genuine championship-level toughness and technical defense. This wasn't a one-sided beatdown in the way some pre-fight predictions suggested it might become. It was a 5-round, physically demanding fight that Makhachev won through consistency, volume, and control, rather than a single dominant, highlight reel finish. It's worth putting this performance in context against the rest of a genuinely stacked UFC 330 card, too. The co-main event saw Mackenzie Dern successfully defend her women's strawweight title against Jillian Robertson, also by unanimous decision, in a fight that followed a somewhat similar arc, with Dern building an overwhelming early lead through grappling control, before Robertson clawed back some competitive moments late. Earlier on the card, Jeremiah Wells pulled off a massive underdog upset over Miktabek Orolbai with a third-round guillotine choke, while Neil Magny extended his own remarkable longevity in the sport with a second-round TKO stoppage of Ramiz Brahimaj. Against that backdrop of finishes and upsets throughout the rest of the night, Makhachev's methodical, control-based decision victory stood out as a different kind of statement entirely. Dominance built on volume and positioning rather than one dramatic knockout blow. That distinction matters for how this result gets remembered. Makhachev didn't need a finish to make his statement. 17 consecutive wins, a new UFC record, and his first successful title defense at welterweight, all secured against a genuinely live, dangerous opponent who forced him to work for every minute of every round, rather than handing him an easy night. For a fighter already being discussed in Mount Rushmore terms by peers like Bilal Muhammad, and placed in rare pound-for-pound company by voices like John Jones, this performance adds concrete, round-by-round evidence to those claims, rather than just reputation and past results. It's worth revisiting exactly what the pre-fight predictions actually said, because this result validates some readings far more than others. Joe Rogan, calling the fight live from cageaside, had specifically flagged that Garry represented genuine danger in open space, while acknowledging he could get smooshed and choked the moment Makhachev closed distance. That read proved remarkably accurate, minus the finish itself. Garry never got smothered into a submission, but he also never found consistent enough success in open space to actually threaten Makhachev on the feet across 5 rounds. Diego Lima's prediction that Garry would land a shot rattling Makhachev's composure before the championship rounds arrived didn't materialize either, at least not in the way Lima described. Makhachev's face showed real damage by round 4, proof Garry's shots were landing, but nothing about his composure or game plan ever wavered throughout the fight. Betting markets, which had Makhachev favored in the range of minus 360 heading into fight night, proved considerably more accurate than some of the more optimistic predictions floating around fight week. The gap between Makhachev's control and Garry's output across the cards, particularly on the two 49-46 scorecards, reflected almost exactly the kind of lopsided but competitive outcome the odds had priced in from the start. For Garry, the loss doesn't erase what he built to get here. He proved his takedown defense, while imperfect against a fighter of Makhachev's caliber, remained functional enough to avoid total domination. He proved his cardio and conditioning could sustain a 5-round pace even while absorbing that level of pressure, and he proved, in flashes throughout round 3 especially, that his striking and counter opportunities were real, even if they weren't frequent or clean enough to actually win the fight on the cards. That 17th consecutive win also carries specific historical weight beyond just the number itself. Makhachev now sits alone at the top of the UFC's all-time winning streak record, surpassing Anderson Silva's mark that had stood since Silva's own historic middleweight reign years earlier. Silva's streak, built primarily at 185 pounds against a golden generation of middleweight competition, had long been considered one of the most untouchable records in the sport's history. Makhachev breaking it, and doing so during his first title defense in a brand new weight class against a genuinely live, undefeated against him opponent, adds real substance to exactly the kind of Mount Rushmore conversation Bilal Muhammad and others have already started having about his legacy. So where does the welterweight division go from here? Makhachev's next move remains an open question, with retirement speculation still lingering in the background despite his own repeated insistence that he wants to keep competing and chasing records. Names like Carlos Prates and Michael Morales continue to circle as the next logical challengers at 170 pounds, fighters who've built their own cases throughout this current run of the division. For Garry, a step back to regroup, or potentially an immediate rematch conversation, depending on how the promotion wants to build its next welterweight storyline, both remain plausible paths forward after a performance that, even in defeat, likely elevated his standing rather than diminished it. What did you think of how this fight actually played out? Did Makhachev's dominance across the takedowns and cage control match what you expected, or did Garry's resilience and that third-round surge surprise you given the pre-fight predictions? There's a real argument that this performance, precisely because it wasn't a spectacular finish, tells you more about Makhachev's true ceiling than any highlight reel knockout could have. Grinding out a full 25 minutes against a genuinely live, well-prepared, physically larger opponent, and doing it with this level of consistency across every single round, is arguably a harder task than finishing a smaller, more predictable style of opponent early. Let us know your breakdown in the comments, and subscribe for more UFC 330 analysis as the full post-fight fallout continues to develop.